So welcome everybody. This is the third webinar, as you may know from the notes, of a series that we're putting on from the working group on health in the WEAll, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. I'm David Somek. I'm the co-chair of the working group, and Amira Patel behind the scenes is the other co-chair. And I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this with Mary Attridge Jones, who will introduce herself in a moment. I came to WEAll via the European Health Futures Forum, which I'm chair of, and I'm part of the steering group of the WEAll All Ireland Hub. So that's my sort of background why I'm here. And the topic, I think that many of you will know perfectly well that the current economy, the based on growth, what some people call an extractive economy, is one that doesn't actually foster social equality, just the opposite. So the argument always was that greater wealth will trickle down and everyone will benefit. The truth is that using any measure you like, it's become perfectly clear that in fact the separation between rich and poor increases with this particular model. And it's one of the many reasons that the well-being economy was floated as a concept, with the idea that it's an economy that serves all of society and all the needs of society rather than just simply making society richer. And why does that matter in relation to health? Well, why it matters is because we know from the social roots of health that in fact the the poorer you are, or the less advantaged, you suffer health-wise. So there's an increasing gap between mortality rates, between amount of sickness people have, and so forth. If that gap between rich and poor grows, and that was shown very dramatically. We've known it for 20 years or so and trying to tackle it, but not succeeding very well. But COVID showed it very dramatically, where there was much greater mortality rate or morbidity with people who were disadvantaged. Now, the question is what to do about it, because although, as I said, policy people, people interested in health generally, have known that there's this major problem of health inequity, but it's not been successful in doing anything about it. Now, we think at WEAll that it's partly because they're not addressing the major root of this difference, which is the economic model itself. And at WEAll, people are dedicated to try and change the economic model. Now, in the meantime, what on earth do we do about this big gap? And in a sense, that's what this webinar is about. We know we haven't got a magic solution, but what we're looking at, if you like, is green shoots, is that despite the economic model, people are working at small but in significant ways that the problem could be addressed. And what we're bringing now is three amazing speakers from Ireland, from England, from India, who are able to tell us something about what's happening locally that might make a difference. And these, we think, are clues to how the problem might be solved in the longer term. So that's my spiel. Just to say a couple of things. First of all, before Mary also gives you a short introduction, this is going to be recorded, as you know. There'll be a recording of the whole event on YouTube reasonably soon. If you please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and we will be collecting the chat to look at afterwards anyway, so it won't be lost. whatever you say in there. And we'll have a few minutes in between things to to have some of the issues you might want to raise in the chat to discuss among our panelists. So that's my introduction. Mary, would you like to take over?
Thank you, David. Welcome everybody to our webinar 3. So our title today is How Could the Wellbeing Economy Reduce Health Inequalities? Because this is about health, I'm just going to take a pause for a moment. We've all been very busy. We've rushed here and you're investing your time and energy. So I'm just inviting you to take a pause for one moment. And if you're comfortable in your chair, just to place your feet, feel the ground beneath. Know that we're connected. And now just to allow your shoulders to drop and to know that your head is supported. And just to feel a little bit of presence around you and that there is a connection here, even though we're on Zoom. There's a connection to each and every one of us, no matter where we are in the world and no matter what background we have and no matter what profession we work in. And just to know that we are approaching this together. And now I just invite you to come back and be present together. And so thank you. David introduced the idea, I suppose, about how health inequality shows up in our world. And I liked this, the WHO, so puts it very simply, I think, is that the broader determinants of health encompass the conditions people are born into, grow up in, work in, live in, and age in. And so basically our environments matter. They matter for our health as we age, and the conditions in which our environment present us. And so I would propose for you to just today to consider these broader determinants of health as something, as we listen to our marvelous speakers speak about their grassroots projects, and just maybe to set an intention for yourself. There'll be lots of knowledge, and there'll be lots to process and consider, but just to set one intention for each speaker, something to take away for yourself today. And again, I welcome you all and the investment that you're making in health being here today. Thank you. I'm now going to introduce our first speaker. And so I'm introducing Vanessa Conroy. I'm delighted to have met Vanessa on a few occasions. And today, Vanessa is going to lead us on some slides over a period of about 12 minutes. Vanessa is a project officer of Feminist Communities for Climate Justice, a joint project between the National Women's Council and Community Work Ireland, so a combination, a partnership. And their aim is to put a gendered, feminist and community work lens on climate justice. Vanessa has worked on occasion as a lecturer and as an academic tutor in Maynooth University in the Department of Applied Social Studies in Ireland. She teaches there also on environmental policy, climate justice, and the intersectional environmentalism, and the connection between gender and the climate crisis. So I welcome you, Vanessa, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Oh, you've shared my slides. Thank you very much. I was scared my computer might collapse if I tried to do it, so that's great. Thank you very much for having me this evening. As Mary said, my name is Vanessa Conroy. I work for the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice project. If you're free to go to the next slide there. Really what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about our own work, and then I hope to talk about kind of the actual topic at hand, where we'll be talking about careful economies at our project, which is kind of the same idea as the wellbeing economy. And so really at the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice project, what we want to do is change the conversation on climate change in Ireland, particularly amongst those like socially excluded or marginalized communities who we know will face the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Really what we want to do is make it less of a kind of distant kind of problem that seems detached and not immediate, and really tie it to issues of social justice and inequality. And so using the climate justice lens to approach the issue of climate change. And how we do that is we also tie it to everyday impacts of life that climate does touch. So things, particularly in Ireland, the housing crisis, access to transport, health, which we will be discussing, food and access to food, and also very importantly for us in our feminist approach, care and caring work. And the project at its core is about capacity building in education and upskilling community workers and those involved at the grassroots level in communities in talking about climate change in a different way. So you can go to the next slide there. And at our project, we have our own kind of bespoke definition of climate justice. I think everybody has their own definition, but the long and short of it really is that the impacts of climate change and climate breakdown will not be felt evenly. And for those who are already marginalized or socially excluded or disadvantaged in our societies throughout the world and in Ireland as well, these communities will feel worse impact and be disproportionately disadvantaged by not only the impacts of climate change, but also government policy response to climate change in the existing kind of extractive capitalist system. What we see is that reducing social inequality and reducing carbon emissions are complementary goals which should be pursued at the same time. And this means not just greening or net zeroing our existing extractive system. And we need systemic transformation. Otherwise, we just have low carbon sexism or zero emissions homelessness, which we really need to aim for higher than this, and we can. And these are complementary goals. We also, within our own definition, acknowledge that climate change is a threat multiplier, basically exacerbating existing inequalities in our society. So you can go to the next slide there. And we did a piece of work with the University College Cork, the Feminist Climate Justice Report. And this is basically a baseline review of the impacts of climate policy in Ireland on women and marginalized communities, because we've little to no data on this until we created this report. And so in addition to our definition of climate justice, we have 5 dimensions of climate injustice to add to it, basically saying that those marginalized and socially excluded groups in the face of climate change, again, have contributed the least greenhouse gases to causing climate change, but are more vulnerable to climate change themselves. As I said, they tend to be burdened by the policy approach taken by governments currently to tackle the climate crisis. They're also least likely to see the benefits of those policies, like tax breaks or reduced prices for early adoption of things like electric vehicles or energy efficiency upgrades. And they also, quite crucially, don't have their voices heard in decision-making spaces. Their experiences are not often reflected in policy, and they are far less likely to actually be in those spaces to be well represented in the climate policy discussion. And just to go through the reasons the project came about for both project partners, really to fill a need for the membership base. They're both membership organisations, the National Women's Council and Community Work Ireland, for community workers working on the ground in grassroots communities all over Ireland with groups who are marginalised or socially excluded or socioeconomically disadvantaged. These workers knew that climate change and the policy response would have a disproportionate impact negatively on these communities, but they felt they did not have the confidence to communicate or talk about climate change with communities who are essentially fighting fires in their day-to-day lives, trying to pay their energy bills, trying to put food on the table. Climate change is not an immediate issue for them, but they wanted to try and kind of highlight the impacts that climate change is having on their lives already. In terms of the membership base of the National Women's Council, the members wanted the council to pursue climate justice in their ongoing work, and also to develop a domestic feminist analysis of climate justice issues in Ireland. And finally, we're also responding to data and policy gaps here in Ireland in that our climate policy doesn't adequately pay attention to the impacts of climate change or the climate policy we create on women in all of their diversity, on marginalized communities. And so we have policy which exacerbates those inequalities as a result. So we want to try and fill some of those gaps. So you can go to the next slide. I'm going to fly through some of our main project outputs over the last 3 years. As I mentioned before, the piece of research we did with University College Cork, the Feminist Climate Justice Baseline Report, again, kind of giving us an overview of the impacts of Irish climate policy at this moment in time on women and marginalised communities. We also ran with Maynooth University a 20-week certificate programme, upskilling a group in kind of the three legs of the project stool: feminism, climate justice, and community development. And there's a photograph of our graduates there. And we also have a network attached to the project of about 170 individuals and organizations, all kind of behind the idea of pursuing climate change as a social justice issue and using feminist and community development approaches. You can head to the next slide there. And then some of the other work we do policy advocacy work. We would respond to government policy consultations, particularly around climate and climate adjacent issues. And we would also bring in the lived experiences and case studies of marginalised communities that we work with, particularly the likes of the traveller community, Ireland's Gaeltacht and offshore island areas, disabled persons organisations, groups who might not have the capacity to respond to these consultations, and we want to make sure that their experiences are actually represented. We also produce webinars to act as educational tools, and we also produced 2 toolkits quite recently as kind of real legacy pieces of the project's work, kind of condensed into 2 toolkits, particularly for community workers, but really any kind of conversation starter or facilitator to use to start having this conversation on climate change as a social justice issue, and really to kind of help communities spot the climate injustice issues that might be happening in their community at this moment in time. And we'll also be running a very short social media communications campaign for the last month of the project, talking about climate justice and why we should be caring about it really in an Irish context. So you can go to the next slide there. And again, coming back to the Feminist Climate Justice Report, when I was invited to take part in this webinar, we explored 6 pillars in that report, but there's 2 that I'm going to focus on. I think that will be most relevant, health being kind of the obvious one, but also care. As I said before, we talk about care-centered or careful economies within our project, and that's what I want to tie to the well-being economy approach. So you can head to the next slide there. In terms of kind of the domestic Irish context of health inequality in the face of climate change, really there is a lack of kind of appropriate attention to the impacts of climate change for existing health inequalities and possible new health inequalities in Ireland, particularly for the health concerns of people who already face marginalisation or barriers in accessing healthcare in Ireland. So we would talk again about women and all of their diversity and other marginalised communities in Ireland. And I think also very important to the Irish context here is Ireland's kind of unique healthcare inequality in itself, and that Ireland really is the only Western European country without universal coverage for primary health care. And you can see there that quite shocking figure which illustrates the public-private divide in access to healthcare, and that as of just last month, there are still 730,533 people on some form of public hospital waiting list in this country. Whereas if you have the disposable income to avail of private healthcare, then you can skip those waiting lists that are often months or years waiting for coverage, particularly in terms of mental health care. We have very, very long waiting lists. And if you can't afford to pay to skip that queue, then you are essentially left waiting and waiting. The data that we do have as well in terms of kind of environmental injustice in Ireland, we find things like poor air quality, tree coverage, access to green spaces. These tend to be concentrated in certain geographical areas, so areas where we have high concentration of socioeconomic disadvantage, or among communities, again, that have the least influence or power in the policy making process. So you can go to the next slide there. And just 3 more points. I won't go through all of these in enormous detail, but really in Ireland, kind of our living case study of environmental or climate injustice is the traveller community. We see incredibly high rates of energy poverty. We see a lot of rates of living in mobile homes or caravans with really bad energy inefficiency, huge rates of child asthma amongst the traveller population and children. And that is as a result of things like burning solid fuels or burning rubbish in order to keep warm, and kind of the implications for your respiratory health as a result. Particularly at the Women's Council, the impacts of climate change for reproductive health is a big concern for us. And then again, especially for people trying to access reproductive health services who already have impeded access to healthcare, whether it's because you're a member of a marginalized community or because you don't have the money to avail of access to healthcare, or maybe you live in a rural area where there's poor access to healthcare services in general. But we're talking about things like exposure to air, soil, and water pollution, and the impacts of like extreme heat as well, that increase the health risks of pregnant people and babies. So you can head to the next slide there. I pulled this quote from the Irish Environmental Protection Agency's recent climate change assessment of Ireland, because I think it really speaks to what we could do. And it's good to see kind of bodies, official bodies like this, acknowledging the way that we could be doing things differently, in that fairer and more equal societies are more resilient to climate impacts. And we know this. And they specifically say the prioritization of well-being and equity in the development of our climate policies basically would bolster support for the dramatic transformations we need to meet our kind of carbon emissions targets, and to transition our economy from extractive and capitalist and greenhouse gas producing to one that could improve quality of life, that could create decent work and value care work better in our society. You can head to the next slide there. And so again, we use the kind of careful approach, or the careful economy, in the pursuit of climate justice in our own work, largely because care work is really key to how women all over the world experience and are impacted by the climate crisis. Largely because caring work is still highly gendered all over the world, but it's also linked to kind of the provision and use of food, of energy, transport choices, and security. And these are all areas that will be heavily impacted either by environmental degradation or the policy transitions that we're making in our economies in order to kind of green our economies or to reach net zero. They're also treated the same way, care work and environmental resources, under our current extractive economy. They're seen as seemingly infinitely available, and to serve that system. But that same system also renders them invisible, undervalues them, and exploits them, despite their absolute necessity to our continuing lives, and also to the continuation of that same system that undervalues them. And so what we say and propose is that climate policies which centre care, or economies which centre care, would create infrastructure which would better enable us to care for both each other and for the planet. But our current infrastructure makes caring more difficult, and that's our issue. So you can head to the next slide there. So obviously caring and health are deeply intertwined. Societies and economies which better enable care enable the provision of us to care for sick friends or family. They also allow communities to care for each other in the face of climate breakdown, also increasing cohesion and resilience to impacts of climate change, and allow also time for the elimination of environmental ills in the name of a holistic treatment to ill health. Because we know if we have an ill environment, if we have polluted air, polluted water, then that has ramifications for our health as well. And so that's why we think a careful or a well-being approach would be so crucial in taking this holistic treatment, not just to the ill health of humanity, but to the ill health of non-human creatures and our planet. And then as a result, we would say that careful or well-being economies which enable care through the provision of things like decent jobs in the care sector, time policies with objectives like reducing working time, things like the 4-day working week or reducing working hours, and diversifying income support policies, things like universal basic income or forms of participation or care incomes to properly value work, like restoring biodiversity, like caring for each other in our communities, would allow for care of the environment to be better resourced because it would reduce time poverty amongst people. We see so often people who are carrying out caring duties as well as carrying out a full-time job, or we see high rates of burnout in caring jobs, whether that is in social care or in education, kind of alleviating the load that these people carry would allow people to have more time to appreciate nature around them and also give them time to dedicate to caring for the environment and restoring biodiversity. And so the appropriate valuation of caring and care work is really key. And that's why I think a careful or well-being approach is not just crucial for us in treating healthcare inequalities, but also for that holistic treatment of environmental health, which impacts us all so much. So that is actually it for me. If you want to go to the next slide, it's just kind of a list of resources. You can access our full Feminist Climate Justice Report using that QR code. And I've also left my email contact details if you'd like to get in touch. But thank you again for inviting me to contribute.
Vanessa, thanks very much. And indeed, although some people have asked, for example, why so much so much focus on climate, I mean, the fact is, what you conclude with is, of course, rounds the circle, as it were, and makes it very clear. I think we all accept that care is a crucial part of the well-being economy, and it is because we think of health in a holistic way is really why what you said matters so much. So thank you again for your contribution. Now we should move on then to our next speaker from India, Dr. Abhay Shukla, but I'm devastated to say that we've had a major technical hitch which prevents Abhay from joining us. So what I'm going to do is do my best to present his slides, because he's very kindly sent the slides. He's just been prevented from actually joining us by this technical glitch, which we'll have to investigate afterwards. We tried very hard during Vanessa's talk, but we just couldn't make it happen. So what sorry, I have to turn to my hidden collaborator, Amira. Can we then share Abhay's slides so that I can present them for him?
I think we're probably best to move straight on to Orla.
All right. Well, I'm sorry about that, but then we have to just be light on our feet and deal with this. So I'll next then introduce, with great pleasure, Orla McCann, who's coming to us from part of England, the north of England, I guess. It's actually part of Manchester. It is, isn't it, Orla?
Yeah, Greater Manchester, Salford, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that I'll leave it to Orla to introduce herself. I think what really encouraged me to invite her was that this whole thing about community wealth building is one of the aspects of the well-being economy, which I think is missing from other previous perspectives on how we might tackle this major problem. So Orla, look forward to your presentation, so please.
Thank you. I'll just share my slides quickly with everyone. Are those working for everyone? Yeah. So, as David said, my name's Orla McCann. I am originally from Ireland, but I work in England. I'm based in Greater Manchester, and a lot of this work is that I'll be talking about this evening is based in Salford, a city in Greater Manchester as well, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment too. I work for a community benefit society based in Salford. We work across Greater Manchester. It's called Unlimited Potential, and we focus on what we call social and economic innovation. And I'm also a member of the steering group that is currently developing the WEAll England hub as well. So that's just a wee bit about me. So for maybe many of you that don't know, Salford, it's a city in Greater Manchester, and it's has quite a lot of history. Definitely worth looking into if you're interested. A lot of firsts have taken place in Salford as well, things like the first midwife and first library and things like that. So a very historical city, but it was one that is now very post-industrial. So it's quite different from the past Salford that many people might know. It's moved on a lot in the kind of last few decades. And what we know now about Salford is that there was a lot of widespread deprivation, but from the last census data, we've learned that actually half of the city are doing quite well, but we still have half of the city not doing well. And although there has been a lot of positive things and happening in Salford, that wealth isn't spreading to one half of the city, and it's very similar localities and neighborhoods which are still affected by low wealth and disadvantage as well. So and experience a lot higher health inequalities. So that's something that we wanted to address with our growing community wealth work. So as we know, not just where I'm based, but definitely throughout the UK and probably on an international level as well. Economic inactivity has increased, unfortunately, since 2020. And on some of the current trends reported by the Health Foundation in its Health Inequalities in 2040 report, that inequalities in health will persist over the next 2 decades, and people in the 10% most deprived areas can expect to be diagnosed with major illness a decade earlier than people in the 10% least deprived areas. And for us in Salford, this means that up to half the population will experience this, given the kind of split down the city in terms of inequality. So we're working on trying to reshape the narrative on the economic system and our current economy. We should remember that it was designed, which means that it can be redesigned. So we have to kind of keep that hope with it as well and work towards that. And we really don't have to be stuck with the economy that we have now. And that's a really important point that we want to share and make as well. And if we want better health, we need that economic change. So I'm just going to show a really quick video. It's just about a minute long. Let me know if the sound doesn't work on it. But for us, this really, I suppose, grounds exactly why we think the addressing health inequalities is so urgent. So yeah, we know that a child born in a low wealth neighborhood risks spending nearly 20 fewer years in good health than a child born in a prosperous one. And they also risk dying 10 years earlier as well. So what was our approach in Salford then? What exactly have we been doing? Well, we've spent about 3 years co-producing an alternative economic model with what we call local anchor institutions and local people to create a solution to the growing inequality here in Salford. And growing community wealth with a focus on ownership and control was our approach to moving towards a fairer and more inclusive economy, and one that would benefit everyone. Growing community wealth has had success in a variety of places globally, but it looks different from place to place as well. And with a focus on the local challenges and opportunities that existed, we focused on three main aspects with our work. So we really wanted to create the right system conditions, and that kind of includes things like the policy, the local anchor institutions, which are those local large organisations from the public, private and BCSE sector that are really rooted here in the city and kind of aren't going anywhere. And then also local people here as well. And we wanted to ensure that all three elements had their role to play in creating a fairer and healthier economy. And from the kind of pillars of growing community wealth, in Salford, this related most to us with progressive procurement and plural ownership of the economy as well. But there are others, like fair employment and use of land and buildings as well. So, but really through this work, we really want to highlight the skills, experience, and resourcefulness and those ambitions that exist within local people and communities, and match these to the power and resources that are owned and controlled by these agencies that we're working with as well. So in terms of the right system conditions, those policy conditions, well, they are really important so that we can create an environment that is receptive to this change that we need, and they're willing to make those changes to the economy to allow everyone a chance to participate equally and create a healthy life for themselves. And these lie partly in local strategies and policies. And embedding approaches to growing and sharing power in policy and strategy is key to effecting that system change. And this work through our Economies for Healthier Lives project, which this was part of, resulted in different spin-off projects for us. Like we did work around reimagining the purpose of town centres, economics within a child-friendly city, and also influencing the Live Well approach across Greater Manchester as well. And that's a big priority here locally. So the local policy and strategy are being refreshed in Salford this year. And so this means that we have a really great opportunity, and we've been kind of working on this long enough to have a lot of learning come from it. And we have a great opportunity to have this work reflected in these strategies. And for that, the local system here to commit to a more inclusive economy and to address those determinants of health and wellbeing. So the local anchor institutions, so these are those local agencies that are rooted in a place and they hold power in regards to their size, their spend, and who they employ. And they can have a really significant impact on their local area when they are recognized as economic entities in themselves, and they can interact with local people in lots of new and different ways. And some of the examples of the local anchor institutions that we work with are things like the hospital, the university, the local city council, private companies, large ones that are really based and rooted here in Salford, and some social housing providers as well in the VCSE sector. And we established the Salford Local Anchors Network, which consists of 9 of these local anchor institutions. And as I said, it was a cross-sector effort in getting all of those involved because the power and spend and size that they are matters to all those sectors, and they can all have an impact on kind of growing community wealth and using that power and spend in a better way. So through this, we did a short exercise where we analysed the supply chains of some of these local anchor institutions, and in 1 year we were able to identify about £10 million of spend that was what we deemed transferable. So this is money that was spent every year, regardless of budgets, for these anchor institutions to be able to run. But if spent differently, i.e. with like locally or socially driven businesses or enterprises, it could have a really significant positive impact on the local area and interact with local and social businesses differently. So this was examples of things like grounds maintenance, pest control, food and catering. So these organisations were spending this money year upon year. But at that point, this £10 million wasn't being spent locally. So that money was essentially leaving Salford. And by shifting that and changing that money could, spread across Salford much more effectively and have a greater impact on people's lives locally. And this is just one way that local anchor organisations can use their impact in better ways to grow that community wealth. And then the final element for that practical part of our work was the work that we did with local people. So at the same time, we worked with local people to support them to set up and learn about social enterprise in an area that I mentioned before, identified in those supply chains, and also some of their ideas as well. And for us, the element of involving local people in this was really important because it's something that we hadn't really seen yet in community wealth building or growing community wealth as a whole. And we know that there are already so many resources existing in our communities with people like the ones here in this photograph that are really skilled, they're ambitious, they're driven, and they're passionate about the place that they live. And creating a better future for themselves and something that they have hope for the future with too. But they often have really little connections because of the area that they grew up in or live in, to kind of entering into things like business ownership or the social economy. And we really wanted to work on connecting these people to these new or existing opportunities with the anchor institutions. So we think that spreading this approach would enable communities to create local supply chains and ecosystems of businesses that are much more likely to recirculate wealth locally. And these such actions could eventually infuse this money into the local economy, and more ownership of businesses by local people can also retain that wealth locally, and change also how they're viewed by the ownership and control that they now have in their area. And this will be able to enable them to develop collective wealth, increase resilience, and improve their health as well. And we're continually learning about this process, what works and what doesn't work. And it's really important for us that we ensure that these opportunities for these collective business endeavours were focused in low wealth areas and given to local people, and give them the opportunity to own and control a social business. So another kind of element of what we've been doing around our work with the economy is changing the language around economic growth and business and make it more accessible to a more diverse group of people. We observed, and what people told us when we were doing this work, the local people that we worked with, that the language of economics was often intimidating to not only those local people, but actually also public health teams told us that as well. They felt very far removed from their colleagues in economic development. And the community members as well felt as though they would often make comments like things like, oh, that's nothing to do with me, I don't have a degree, let's leave that up to the professionals type of thing, when actually, the whole time everybody is participating in the economy in whatever way that they are, whether they recognise that or not. And one of the ways that we try to get around that kind of anxiety caused by economic framing, that really traditional industrial economic framing, was to use more organic language. And we centre around kind of growing and nurturing the economy and the role of rooted businesses. And this opened up economic development to people who had either excluded themselves previously or have been excluded and didn't feel that they had a role in anything to do with economics or economic development. And we've created some resources around some of this. So we have our growers guide, and we developed an animation as well, which after this I'll share in the chat for everyone if they want to look at those afterwards as well, if they're interested. But yeah, so then just some kind of final reflections from me. I know we're going to have some time for questions and answers, but if there's a couple of things that might be worth thinking about, or if you've already done something similar, we'd love to hear about it. And if you have any things around either of these points about what would it mean to you to redesign your local economy where you are, and also how can you utilize the resources that exist in your communities already, and do redesign cities so that health inequalities reduce. So there are just some of the things we might want to think about as well. But yeah, that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orla. Indeed, that's you've given us again a great stepping off point for a subsequent discussion. Amira, shall we just open the screens now so that everyone can see each other? Is that possible? Just changing the view for everybody. That'll happen in a minute. Look, I have to. There you are. Thank you. Yeah. So can we? That's right. Can we open it so that that's right. People who want to show themselves on their screens, they don't have to, obviously. Look, we have a major problem here. It's deeply embarrassing, but although it's not our fault, but it seems our dear friend from Maharashtra, Dr. Shukla, has been blocked from joining through a technique from an excessive security reaction by the system. I mean, I have to say, this is the sort of thing we have to live with. I couldn't, I tried to pay for something the other day, and my bank told me there was nothing wrong with my card. It was the people had excessive security because of hacking and so on that actually was preventing me operating. It's a nightmare. But today it means that a really good presentation from a public health doctor who's been working with people in poverty in where he lives in India, and actually improving nutrition for young kids, can't present. Now, we're hoping that he's also had to fly off. He was going to leave us anyway at 6 because their time zone, he's got to fly to Delhi early tomorrow morning. So I'll have to see whether we can post with his permission, his slides subsequently, because I think they're very worthwhile as another example of how we might tackle this kind of problem. But what we're left with then is the fact that we've got more than half an hour. We have we have Orla, Vanessa, me, and Mary, that we kind of panel, but we would very much value others if they want to comment or add something in the chat. Then we can use that to add to what we might ourselves discuss about what we've heard about so far today. I'll certainly, so please do, if you feel so moved, do put comments into the chat. In the meantime, I'll kick off by saying, as I mentioned, although I've worked for many years in the European Health Futures Forum, which is about changing the model of health and healthcare delivery to one that is more fit for purpose than what is really in some ways a 19th century model. And that's really about system change, which is why I was attracted to the Wellbeing economy, which is also about system change, but in a different modality. But of course, everything connects with everything else. So I joined the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and helped, I'm on the steering group of the All Ireland WEAll hub. And we're very, very interested in just the point that Orla raised about narrative, because we think that while it makes total intellectual sense, if you like, to recognize that we need a different model of the economy, people are turned off by the notion of the economy being something that's too highfalutin for ordinary people to understand, which of course isn't true, because the fact is they're all affected, we're all affected by it. And the other thing, of course, is that sense of helplessness, that what on earth can we do to bring about such a huge change? And the answer partly lies in exactly what Orla's been talking about, I think, Orla, is do please turn on your mic and so on, so we can actually talk. But it seems to me social cohesion is really a major element, I think, in bringing about change, and people who are working like you in the community working on that, I think, are making a significant contribution, helping us learn how we might change things. So thank you for that. Now, Vanessa, would you like to comment on what Orla's been talking about? I'm sure it makes sense to you too. Just need to unmute your mic. Okay.
Sorry. Do you mind repeating that? Sorry, my internet glitched out a bit. Sorry.
I'm just saying, I wondered, given where you're coming from, how you react to the point I was making that I was taking up of Orla's about how important cohesion is and people working at a community level. That's all.
Absolutely. I mean, for us in the project, we're kind of taking a bottom up and a top down approach in that we know ultimately there are decision makers who can enable or create enormous barriers to participation in things like climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and the kind of health boons or, disadvantages that come with it. But for us, I think, particularly in the climate space, there's a lot of kind of bad news stories, and it is kind of like a huge issue. People feel like, there's not much that they can do. But the truth is really that we do actually have everything we need already. It is about kind of the political will and the redistribution of resources and wealth. There's an enormous amount of community initiatives going on in terms of redistributing things like surplus food, community energy generation, community transport share schemes. And really, the issue is in terms of infrastructure. For example, Ireland's grid is it doesn't have the capacity at the moment to complete the energy transition we need to make, even if we do have communities generating their own energy. And it is about I think, this technocratic approach that's still so often taken, in that the carbon capture technology or this new kind of technology that we haven't perfected or invented yet will save us, and we won't have to change anything in the way that we currently conduct our economy or the way that we constantly pursue growth. And I think the reality is that as we were kind of talking about, we do need an entirely new structural economic approach to tackle this. And because we don't have infinite environmental resources and we can't have a planet with infinite growth on it, it's not good for anyone's health, human or non-human. And so really the political will needs to be changed in order to kind of resource what is already going on the ground in our communities, but also the fact that communities that are more resilient and that are more self-sufficient are able better to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I think perhaps most importantly, co-create or entirely create their own adaptation strategies to climate change, because we have seen instances, particularly when we're talking about things like the just transition for kind of making certain jobs obsolete, particularly in the Midlands in Ireland with peat production, where that was phased out entirely with very little kind of interaction or consultation with the workers involved in that industry. And you've had a huge loss, not only kind of industry, which was eventually going to have to be phased out, but also a real kind of cultural identity, particularly in the Midlands in Ireland. And so if you kind of intervene without proper kind of community not only community kind of consultation, but also not allowing the community to kind of own their own adaptation strategies. You create resentment and distrust in climate action coming from government. And so I think it is really important that communities are directly involved, particularly at the grassroots level, and resourced to create their own adaptation strategies. Because at the end of the day, you could be an incredibly well, like well-researched climate scientist, but you're not going to know a community better than the people who've lived in it their whole lives.
Yes, I think also the point you're making about that, going back to to COVID, there's no doubt that although there has to be some top-down activity and people control the purse strings through the tax system and so on, the fact is that when people let go, for example, in England, and allowed the local people to manage the pandemic, it works so much better. It's all about control. But I think there's another issue which you're kind of raising there, and you mentioned the peat growers and so on. This change is also about value systems, isn't it? It's about respecting people and actually genuinely engaging them rather than treating them in an arrogant way. And that, like the issue of care, it's all part of a package, I think, which the wellbeing economy attempts to encompass in a worthwhile way. Mary, do you want to add something at this point?
I think this is coming together really well. Thank you, David. I'm really heartened to hear about the projects that are, alive and well and working. And it just shows, I suppose, the hope of the strength of community and people where there's cohesion and people are collaborating together. But they're doing it for their own community first and foremost, because that's where they know. And I think this is the thing about top-down policy. No policymaker is going to know the community the way the people that live there, born there, age there are. And they are the ones that are the change makers. They're the ones that can bring this systemic transformational change. And as I speak like that as a coach, I would say the important part here in systems change and about behavioral change is that people's integrity is at stake here. So respect, care, trust, advocacy, but also autonomy. Voices matter, their voices matter. And it's not an add-on. It's really from the grassroots up. And what I hear is like, especially the projects that they take an idea that somebody hasn't thought about. These are innovative ideas, and they'll design how to put that into action. What they need really is that Vanessa did mention about that supports, from the top down, but they need the autonomy to use that support in the way that's right for them. And I find that in Ireland with local authorities, very often you may get grant funding, but then when you get it, there's a whole pile of reporting that has to be done. And if you deviate in any way from what your original plan was, which is not really keeping up with our climate adaptation, as things are evolving so quickly, and then in somehow you may not get the rest of the grant, might not be drawn down, or next time you may be penalized and not get a grant. So what I'm saying here is the autonomy, the support, yes, and that also involves, I suppose, the expertise that comes with support. That's open to communities, but also to allow them flexibility of how it's used, because they know best.
Yes, and that comes back to the issue of trust, doesn't it? I mean, I think it's this culture of a fear of being called out, by having made a mistake or something, And that's very pervasive at the moment, isn't it? It's again a very negative aspect that's crept into our culture, the lack of tolerance and willingness to acknowledge that people aren't perfect, but always to find scapegoats and to point fingers and so on. And that's, again, it's back to value systems, I suppose. But I suppose what I'd like to really ask as well is, of course, what do people feel about the fact that there are very powerful agents that are very difficult to influence, because it's the whole thing, isn't it, with the wellbeing economy about how do you get turkeys to vote for Christmas? You know, the fact is that someone has to give something up, you know, to allow this to happen, and they will say, well, you know, okay, I make huge amounts of money out of damaging the environment because that's what I want. I want money. I mean, the environment can look after itself. It'll either will or it won't, long after I've gone. So, you know, it's that kind of selfish approach to wealth creation, which seems almost impossible to tackle. And yet it's very clearly a major factor in preventing more sensible change.
David, I'd like to come in there. I'd just like to see what people think about long range thinking, you know, in relation to our environment, in relation to health, and also the legacy that we leave for the next generations and those after those. And I suppose really our policies often are for, you know, they're for political terms, and they don't look too far beyond that. But that really drastically needs to change. The voice that says, you know, we need policies that are looking far beyond the lives that are here now on planet Earth. And this is really essential when you talk about biodiversity, because what is lost and can't be regained, and will avert catastrophe if we keep in the same trajectory as we're going now. And so no systems provision of health is going to change that. And that might sound a bit gloom, but I think sometimes we need to call it out what it is. And that action promptly needs long-range thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to now, Chris has raised his hand. I don't know, Amira, can we facilitate it that Chris can actually join the conversation?
Yeah, I should be able to speak.
Yep.
Yeah, here you go.
Yeah,
Welcome.
Thank you. I suppose just picking up really on what Mary's just said, and also what Vanessa touched on in terms of getting the right balance between top down and bottom up. So there's clearly something around I think for the system itself to create the right conditions for this activity to happen, that either enables or allows people, local people and communities to do their stuff. But in terms of that long range thinking that Mary touched on, I think that there's some really good examples of where that has happened that we could perhaps draw on. So for example, the example in New Zealand, where a river now has a legal person, it can take people to court in order to prosecute them for environmental damage and so on. And similarly in Wales, the Welsh Senedd, the Parliament in Wales introduced something called the Future Generations Act, which, and there's now a commissioner who has influenced really serious policy decisions. So they prevented the building of a motorway, for example, because they're able to represent the interests of human beings who haven't even yet been conceived. So I think there's an element within this discussion around how we can identify those examples, make more people aware that it is possible to do these things, and also that there are people in positions of power and wealth who are willing to make those changes. The one other thing, I think when we work with local people, often the language, I think as Orla touched on, can be very industrial and very masculine around the economy. And shifting into that more organic framing can be really, really helpful. And one of the things that we found useful, I think, around the issue of power is often the debate is framed in terms of shifting power, as if it's a finite resource. And actually, power isn't a finite resource. It is not a zero-sum game. And so often what we find when we're working with local people is we can reframe it and talk about growing new power. You don't have to wait for somebody else to give you power or to necessarily to grab it out of their hands. It is possible for people to come together, as they have done in history, and grow new power. So in the way that people in the past created things like cooperatives and building societies and credit unions and trade unions and so on, they didn't wait for somebody to give them permission. They said, we're going to come together. And I think the challenge that there is in many parts of the world, certainly in the last 40 years, is that we've been given this very individualistic way of looking at the world, as if we all have to just do our own thing and you're on your own. And what we found in working with many young people here is that they don't know that these collective economic options are even options. It's not included in the education system, that there's very few places to learn. But when they're made aware that these options exist, many of them actually get really inspired. So that there's something, just to finish off, I think, about how can we draw on what our predecessors achieved in the past around these things. What does that mean in the 21st century, particularly in a digital environment where we're responding to Silicon Valley rather than the industrialists of the 19th century? And then what can we do to inspire young people and future generations to go, there are alternatives to this, and not just make it a theoretical exercise, but to point at really hard examples of where people are doing this either locally for them or indeed in other countries.
I think that's really helpful, Chris. Certainly, I know in the All Ireland Hub, we're also very interested in the Future Generations movement as a means of creating community involvement. As you say, young people perhaps need some help in being educated about things that have worked in the past, but they still have open minds in a way that many of us unfortunately don't anymore. And I'm happy to say, of course, they're our future, but it's how to mobilize that now, isn't it? Which is the challenge, I think. Anyone else? Look, I'm conscious that the time's going on, and we're people are gradually moving off. But anyone else like to just add anything? Orla, do you want to respond to what's been said at this point?
Yeah, I resonated a lot with a lot of the points that Vanessa made, especially I think around that advocacy around policy and almost that translation of policy for people who don't have the time and resources to be able to access that and actually, understand how it will affect people and just the way the policy is designed to do that. So I think that's really important, and that kind of was some of our work as well, and some of the things that we sort of include around those system conditions, bringing different people's voices into that and making sure that it's kind of not about people being hard to reach, but actually people just not being listened to or brought into the conversation at the right times. And then I think there was also a point around that kind of balance between that trust and respect. And for us, that was a big thing as well, as we had sort of groups, local people and groups in the community, and then these sort of large organizations and agencies. And there's a lot of we encourage that co-production, and that's how we like to work. But there was a period of coming together to be able to do that, and these agencies having being able to have the trust that local people can own things and run things themselves, and handing contracts over, and you know, being the suppliers from starting from scratch to do that. Because we had these local people who, we know all these skills exist in these communities to do pest control, to do grounds maintenance, to do food and catering, and all the other examples that came out of the supply chain analysis. But for some reason at the time, these agencies were purchasing these goods, works, and services from national companies, and you know, huge organizations, you know, probably a lot to do with costs, effectiveness, and all those sorts of things. And a lot of that did mean, you know, a process of, and it's still very much in process, but learning to let go of things and try, you know, it's really about trying new things to be able to make these changes in the economy. So, you know, when I talked to some of the people who worked in procurement in some of these large organizations, it was like, oh, you know, they've been our supplier for 20 years. How would we end that relationship to, you know, be able to, you know, give this contract, or, you know, tender out this contract to a local supplier? And even though they all agreed that it would be the right thing to do and the better thing to do, and that, you know, how it would benefit the local area, and they wanted to be part of that, and they had the will to be part of that, but it was just those kind of difficulties in actually making those changes. And we needed to get a lot of the buy-in from these kind of senior leaders in these organizations, as well as actually on the other side, you know, helping these local people trust these agencies to do things positively for them, where maybe, you know, in different elements of these agencies, they'd maybe been let down, or they had no relationship to them, or they felt like they didn't want to know them, or they described these people as hard to reach, and all these sorts of things as well. So there was like a process on both sides of, you know, building that trust for both parties to enable these things to happen, and you know, building the relationships for that co-production process to really work. So, and I know Chris has shared some links in the chat as well. We have a Substack where we sort of had around 12 sort of blogs about and talking about some of these things that, you know, that are at, you know, at the center of all this. And it is things like relationships. It is things around understanding power, and how people can grow power themselves. You know, these were really central to, you know, what we're doing to make this successful as well. So yeah, they were just some of the reflections I had as everybody was talking.
Thanks, Orla. Okay, so I think that given the problems we've had with the losing a speaker and so on, it's very good that a few of you have held on and just stayed with us for this. But I wonder, Mary, do you think that we should think about trying to sum up what we've heard, and then perhaps Orla and I will just talk about, sorry, I beg your pardon, Amir and I will talk very briefly about where we go from here.
Yeah, so in summary, I think I'd like to pick out a few phrases that were shared, and I think that this is because of the richness of our conversation just now. It's not just our main speakers, it would also bring in some other comments from other people. So it's a collective contribution. Thank you. So I would start off that how Vanessa shared with us about how important it is that carbon emissions and inequalities are managed at the same time, simultaneously in relation to policy. And that care and caring work need to be really core principles as we move forward for climate justice. I also would put forward that the EPA reference of saying that fairer and more equitable societies are more resilient is exactly what we need into the future in the world we're living in now. And so I think that's a great phrase for us all to take home. And Orla was sharing with us the grassroots. Sorry, now I have my notes here. Yeah. So about community wealth and the fairer, greener and healthier approach for unlimited potential. And for me, I think we all have potential to move forward. And if we know that there's nothing holding us back, nothing is going to pull us back, maybe something ahead that we have to navigate and steer by, and work in a different way. But I really like that unlimited potential project name, because to me it just says, yes, we have that ability to move forward, and it brings hope to projects. The other thing that I felt that was really important today was, I suppose, the acknowledgement of in every community, probably not just in the Greater Manchester area, not just in Ireland, but in every community we have disadvantage. And coming back to the, I suppose, the parameters for health, equity, and just looking at the broader determinants of health, as I mentioned at the outset, really we need to think of where people are. And I think Orla put that together. She's saying like that, you know, half were doing well, half were disadvantaged. And I think that that probably goes across the board without statistics to back that up. In most cities, in most areas, there are always those. And I think, I suppose a message there was, you know, do not assume that everybody is doing well. And in relation to health, that's something that we as individuals, I think, can take forward. It's about that caring piece that Vanessa was talking about. It's about caring for one another and watching out and finding those that are marginalised and helping them to feel included and giving them a voice and having them be part of our projects. And then enabling them for social enterprises, and building hope with this, that they can recirculate wealth within their economies, and that they are local economies, and that they are taking ownership for that, and how empowering that can be in a local community. And then I suppose changing the language, as we discussed earlier, and David had said how important that is to the WEAll Health Irish Hub, and just looking at that. And I will add to this that in Ireland we also use the arts, I suppose, in a very special way, looking at narrative and how to help that expression of narrative. And so there is a movement within Ireland on that, which is growing. And then I suppose the other word, I suppose, was anchors, you know, for me, and that transferable money. I think we all know that waste exists in systems, and to call it out and to say this could serve better in another location, it can be diverted. I think it's really important to advocate for that, and that can be done at local level. It takes persistence, it takes courage, but you won't be alone once you've done it. And I think that's definitely when we think about resources and being resourceful into the future, to drive this systems change, we need to look at where that support funding can come from. And very often there is waste to be managed. So thank you for that transfer from the anchors. I think that's all I have for now. I would like to just ask our speakers 2 questions. And when you're not doing this very busy community work and research and everything, I'd like to ask you, Orla, what do you enjoy doing?
So when I'm not doing this, I mostly spend time with my daughter. She's 5, so that takes up a lot of my time, but a very fun age. And I also enjoy running and part of a running club as well. So that's kind of mostly what I do in my spare time at the minute.
Thank you, Orla. And Vanessa, I'd like to ask you, when you're stepping out of your busy schedule, what do you enjoy doing?
I think for me, I really love food and cooking. I've had grown up in a household where I was very lucky to learn to cook from a very young age. So I've always enjoyed cooking and I enjoy eating as well. Um, I really like reading as well, but also kind of after a very busy day, the thing I like doing most is just watching very bad reality television. I think it helps my brain switch off from the busyness of what I'm doing. And I'm not ashamed to say that.
Yeah.
I think we understand that, Vanessa. Yeah.
David, I'm going to take this opportunity to put the question to you, sir. When you're not doing all this work for WEAll Hub Health, you know, and all the other hats I'm sure you have, what do you enjoy doing?
Well, I'm also very much, I love food and cooking. So I'm learning even now. I'm my advanced age. I'm learning more about Japanese food, for example, what to do with the things that are now available that were never available here in England 50 years ago. And I love reading and music, and also just really just enjoying the countryside. I'm very privileged now in my retirement from my main job, living by the sea and in woodlands. So it's really lovely to enjoy nature in that way. And yourself, Mary?
So, David, I would concur on the nature. Definitely, I'm privileged to be able to work more in nature and help those that are doing projects. But for my own health and well-being, it's a step outdoors. It's putting on the right clothes and wrapping up, especially today being so cold. But it's stepping into the sea. But it's also for me noticing. And I particularly bring attention to that. It is about slowing down and noticing,
Sure.
engaging with. So I think, thank you for sharing. This is a bit of our shared humanity, you know, no matter where we are, who we are, as I said earlier, we're not alone because we do human things. I also think it ends us on a very hopeful, caring note. And I'll hand over now to David to close. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mary, for co-hosting this session. It hasn't gone quite as smoothly as we'd hoped, but then so what? We're adaptable folk. But Amira, would you like to just come in so we can discuss something about where we go from here with this series and the work we're trying to do together within the global
Yeah,
WEAll?
sure. I was just going to share that hopefully there'll be one more of these before the end of the year, and that one will be also focused on inequalities, but with the context of the majority world, so a few other countries,
Yes.
and more representation perhaps from the African continent and from the Indian continent. So that is something to look forward to. And then this group has a really exciting job of synthesizing some of the learnings from this series, which has really been about trying to bridge the gap between what the current health system looks like and what a health, what health in a well-being economy could look like. So hopefully we'll be able to share some of those outcomes next year with everyone who's been attending these webinars. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our wonderful speakers. I'm sure David and Mary also want to thank you for your patience and all that you've been able to share with us. It's been really insightful session, so thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Amira, for saying that. Absolutely. That's where we're at. So look, as I said right at the beginning, this session will be available on YouTube within a few days or a couple of weeks or whatever, if you want to review it. But yes, we're going forward, and we do invite anyone who's interested. Please do get in touch with myself or Amira if you want to perhaps even join the working group or contribute to it. We think it's a worthwhile thing to do. There's often people think of the way people talk about the well-being economy. It's often just it's all about either about social equity or about the climate and so forth. But in fact, there's a lot more to it than that. And indeed, I'd love to hear more about what education would look like, and people having maximum opportunity to fulfill their potential. And this is all part of the same dream, really, that the wellbeing economy represents. But we sincerely believe, that's why we're here, that it can, even though it's a very long-term project, that it's something that will bring us all to a better life, really. So at that point, I'd like to say thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks.